I had the pleasure to meet for the first time about an hour ago. The best way to describe him, I believe, is that he's a creative with a sustainable focus. No matter what I say here, I won't be able to do him justice on the things he's done and the things he's looking to do. So I'm going to leave you with him, and he's going to run you through the first section.
Thank you. Hi. So here I am today talking about something that I'm very passionate about and I've been working on for more than 10 years now. And it's a concept that is, I think, something that really needs to happen because our food system is, I believe, the cause of most of what's wrong with the world today. 2/3 of the world's arable land's used for growing food. And if we stick with the current system that we've got today, we're going to need a lot more to feed the growing population. At the same time, we're using about 1 million tonnes of synthetic fertilizer to grow those crops. So what's known as the green revolution, the creation of synthetic fertilizer, is what's really changed the food system to allow us to be able to grow unbelievable yields, huge amounts of food. But I actually think that actual invention, the invention of the synthetic fertilizer, has been the cause for and the reason why we suffer depression, anxiety, mental illness generally, but also loss of fertility amongst us. I mean, IVF in Australia alone is $1 billion business today. And that's because our food is not providing us the nutrients that we need. So there are doctors that actually believe that we're only getting 1/20th the amount of nutrients that we needed. So just to give you a comparison, a primitive tribe 200 years ago, 150 years ago, achieved up to 15 times the nutrient density in their diet that we achieve today. So how do I explain that? Well, a good way of doing it is say Dan Barber, who's a friend of mine that's got a restaurant in New York called Blue Hill, he worked out through a collaboration that he does with Stanford University that a slice of bread 100 years ago was equivalent in the nutrient value of a loaf of bread today. So our food that we eat is not containing the nutrients that we need. And I think that it's because we've mined all of our soils of all the nutrients that we need to live. So, you know, you can grow great looking plants, great looking crops by putting synthetic fertilizers into the soils. Beautiful carrots, beautiful food. It looks great, but it doesn't contain the nutrients that we need. And that's because we've forgotten the nature's law, which is returning what you need, closing the loop, closing the cycle. And the only way we can do that is by returning what it is that we waste back into our soil. And that's really what the greenhouse was about back in 2008. This is a building that I designed and built in Federation Square in Melbourne. And it was exactly the same footprint as the average Australian house in 2008. I can't remember exactly what it was about 300 square meters. And I wanted to prove that you could grow enough food for a family just by utilizing what it is that we use, so the footprint of the building. So this building had 100 bins on its roof, and we produced a lot of food. One bin alone, 1 square meter bin alone, produced 35 kilos of potatoes. But we had cucumbers, tomatoes, and all sorts of different, I think we had about 120 different crops growing. So this led to more projects. I ended up doing one in Perth. That's a Perth greenhouse where we had bins. This is a really challenging site because it was underneath a big tower, office tower. But we still were able to achieve some of those goals. This is the Sydney greenhouse. That was in full sun, amazing site. But, you know, I'll just go back, talk about Sydney. But so Sydney was great because it was full sun from the morning till night. So we had, I think, about 60 tons of soil on the roof of this building. It was a little bit smaller than the average Australian house. But this project led me to a collaboration with the CSIRO and started me to experiment with different ways of growing food and starting to understand. And what we actually concluded in the end was that the average Australian house could easily grow 7 tonnes of food per annum. the average Australian house also generates 165,000 litres of grey water. So we've got the water and we've got the roof. And so we could easily change our food system and start, instead of using all this land to grow food, we could grow food right where we live. There's so many other benefits that come with covering our buildings with soil and integrating buildings with soil. And that's this fire test that I did with the CSIRO in 2012. This building doesn't contain any synthetic materials. It's completely natural. It's insulated with straw and has about 8 tonnes of soil on its roof. We simulated a full-blown bushfire. So a 45-minute test, which took the temperatures up to 1,000 degrees for 3 minutes in the end, and full flame immersion. And it's still today the only house that's ever survived a full-blown bushfire test like this one. It completely survived, and yeah, inside the indoor air temperature only went up by a few degrees. And because we didn't use any, we only used natural materials, there were no toxins in the air, which is actually the worst thing. Most people actually suffer from the toxicity in the air, because what happens is synthetic materials that are used in buildings, when they start to heat up, they start to release, and that actually causes most people to either faint or kill them. So going forward, I'm partnering again with the CSIRO, and this is where I'm hoping to prove that we can completely change our food system so that we can grow locally. A lot of you here have got commercial or in the commercial game, and you're probably thinking, well, what relevance does this have to the commercial industry? But every time I see a building, this building that we're in, any building, I'm currently staying at the Meriton in Brisbane, and everywhere I look, I see opportunities to utilise what it is that we waste, which is, I think the sunshine, the water, and our nutrients. Give you an example, in Melbourne, the Rialto, I work with Lorenz Grollo, trying to work out how to change that building. And that building has about a 2.5 hectare facade that is a north-facing facade. And it generates about 400,000 litres of grey water a day. Most of it's from washing hands, and can be easily, the technology exists to easily make that water safe. So I've worked out that just by using the rate that we currently produce in Australia, so we're currently producing about 70 kilos under glass, about 70 kilos of tomatoes a square metre. So that means that the Rialto alone could produce 2 million kilos of tomatoes, just by simply changing the skin of the building. Could produce 4 million kilos of cucumbers. So you're starting to understand sort of every building has the capacity to grow serious amounts of food. And then that also means that we're dealing with a lot of the stuff that other people are needing to deal with, the waste. So this project here is in Callista, not far from where I live. It's an old service station site that's currently, I'm trying to get planning approval for. It's not connected to power, it's not connected to sewer. It's completely standalone. So I'm using a company called Re-Electrify in Melbourne. They've invented a battery wall that's made from old batteries, mostly Nissan Leaf, Toyota car batteries, power drill batteries. So there's 7 what we call thermal chimneys, and each thermal chimney at the top has solar tracker. And so we've got solar trackers that are then charging the battery walls. They're also really glazed thermal chimneys, but they're actually for tropical fish. So we've got aquaponic systems, we're growing snails, we're growing about 100 different species of plants here. So what I'm trying to prove here, that we can create a complete diet closed loop, utilising all the nutrients. We've got a toilet system that uses a Swedish toilet, which I trialled at the greenhouse in Melbourne in 2012, which is a urine harvesting toilet, so it's a twin bowl system. In the greenhouse, I think it was in 4 weeks, we harvested 3,000 litres of urine. And in Sweden, by 2020, they want to be completely self-sufficient in fertiliser. So they set themselves that goal in 2006, and they're becoming very close to being able to do that. Just by every new house that's being built has got a urine tank underneath the house, and the government has a system where the urine gets collected and gets used as fertiliser instead of using gas-based synthetic fertilisers. So we're adopting that system here. I'm also using the feces as going into a tank, and it's getting mixed with other organic waste like lettuce leaves and things that can't be used. And in tests up till now, we're getting 6 hours of flame. So in other words, we can cook for 6 hours and use it for heating hot water. That's for one person. So we could get up to 12 hours of flame from 2 people living in one of these buildings. So I call it like intercepting the waste. Then it goes into what's called a AA worm farm system, which is sitting in the at the basement of the, I'm basically using the old oil tanks, the old petrol tanks that are in the ground, reconditioning them. Then that soil, those worm castings are getting taken out with an auger and getting reincorporated back into the soils that are on the roof and on the vertical garden systems. And, you know, we've got, yeah, like I said, a whole diversity of plants. So to me, it's a completely off-grid development. It only uses natural materials, and it's in one of the most dangerous places in the world for bushfire. So I'm utilizing all of the stuff that I've learned to try and create this development that will be obviously resistant to bushfires, but it will also use no energy from the outside world, so it's totally self-sufficient. But for me, the most important thing is actually the most primitive thing. That's actually the worm tank. And to give you an understanding of how vital a worm is to our well-being, and why I think that at the start I was talking about mental health and depression and anxiety and suicide and these things that are becoming a huge problem in the Western world. I believe it's because worms are not part of our food system anymore, whereas they have been in the past. And to give you, for those that are interested in gut flora, and you know, everybody seems to be talking about gut flora these days, one worm has the bacteria count of one worm in its gut is equivalent to the human population on the planet. So between 7 and 8 billion species and numbers of bacteria live in a worm's gut. So every time a worm consumes something, it actually creates what's called vermicast. And plants eat this stuff up. What they basically do is they turn a leaf into, and all the nutrients in the leaf, into available nutrients for plants. All the vitamins and minerals and everything that we need. So a food system that has no worms in it is a compromised food system, in my opinion. And to give you an understanding of, you know, I'm not crazy when I'm talking about this stuff. There's scientists that are starting to see that this actually is true. There's a bacteria called Mycobacterium vacei, which is found in worm castings and in old growth forest floors and on healthy soils. And they fed this bacterium to rats, and the rats navigated a maze in half the time and with a lot less stress than the rats that weren't fed. And I know Pfizer's working on a soil tablet that actually contains this. They're calling it the Soil Tablet Project because they are starting to realize that cognitive ability spikes when this bacteria forms part of the diet. Whereas, of course, we've always had these bacteria. This is just one isolated bacteria. There are hundreds, if not thousands of bacteria that are still being discovered that we don't know about. So to focus on one bacteria, I think, is a mistake. What we need to do is focus on the system as a whole. So again, going back to this idea that we need to have foods coming from healthy soils, foods grown where we live. Can you imagine 9 million houses producing our food? Can you imagine our commercial buildings producing our food? It's going to happen, and it is happening, and I think it's going to happen a lot faster than what we think. And I think it has the opportunity to employ, in a city like Melbourne alone, 1 million people. You would have not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but you possibly have 1 million individual food producers. And I've worked with Google, and I know Google understand that this is happening too. They're developing systems that allow us to trade between people who are growing food at a micro level, because this is micro growing of food. So instead of our food coming from huge monocultures, and instead of the food being dead and old and maybe being harvested, you know, up in Queensland and then sent down to Melbourne, or down in Melbourne and sent up to Queensland, our food's going to be grown within our suburb. We're talking food meters, not food miles. And to me, this is the most exciting concept because it has the ability to completely change the way we produce food, but it also has the ability to completely change our health. And then, best of all, it means that we don't need all this land to grow food. So we can start rewilding land that we're currently using in the Western world to grow crops. And it means that we can grow food right where we live and completely change our urban landscape. So that, to me, this is a testing ground. I am super excited about this. It's getting turned into a documentary with Mad Men Entertainment following the project for 18 months from the start to when a couple move in, and they're going to be followed, and we're going to test the food for nutrient value. We're going to see, is this the stuff we really want to eat going forward? But to me, this is actually truly sustainable food. You know, it's going to be an exciting couple of years ahead. Thank you.